Hello friends and neighbors, and welcome to the first meeting of my Ultimate Recommendation Book Club, in which we will be looking at the prologue of The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. The prologue is titled A Mountain Range of Rubble, and it says, in which our narrator introduces himself, the colors, and the book thief. Typically when there is a prologue in a novel, it's meant to introduce premise or characters or setting or tone, and this one pretty much does all of that. Especially the last one, especially the tone. We can get a really good feeling in the first few pages of this novel what kind of book we're going to be reading. So let's look at the three things that our narrator introduces. Let's start with the colors, because the very first sentence says, first the colors. This is something that's going to come back throughout the novel, but this is something that specifically the narrator takes note of. He often refers to times or moments in terms of colors, a white or a blue or a yellow or a red or something like that. And much like a lot of the things he puts in here, he never explicitly explains what this means. I mean, it's pretty obvious he's referring to the color of the sky, but as we continue reading, we see that it actually does mean more than that. He seems to also be referring to the mood, and there also seem to be some symbolic elements as well, as we'll discuss later on in the prologue. Now, when I first encountered this book in late 2007, I really didn't know a lot about it. I knew it was a World War II story, I knew that it involved hiding a Jew in somebody's basement, I knew it was about a girl who learned how to read by stealing books from Nazi book burnings and so on. And so I thought it seemed like an interesting story, but not a terribly unusual story, not a story that hasn't been done before. And then I started reading the prologue, and I slowly began to realize that the narrator of this story was the personification of death. And that, more than anything, is what compelled me to keep reading. That's what I thought was really, really cool about this book, is the fact that it was narrated by death. But here's the interesting thing. The narrator, at least not in the prologue, he never explicitly states that he is death. He never just comes right out and says, I'm death. But even though he never comes right out and says it, it's pretty obvious that he's death. I mean, he makes it really, really clear. And the fact that death is the narrator means a lot of things about the tone of this novel, many of which are, as I said before, exemplified in these first few pages. First of all, when death has a point to make, he makes it. He doesn't beat around the bush, he's not subtle about it, he doesn't try to bullshit you in any way, he just makes his point and he makes it obvious. More often than not, he makes his point in bold letters that are set apart from the rest of the text, much like this. So he's not fooling around. He's telling you this story for a reason, and he's going to give you the reasons that he is telling you this story. He is going to make his point clear. This isn't just some anonymous and personality-less narrator like we get in a lot of stories. No, this is a narrator with a definite personality and a definite persona. This is death. But while he is being really obvious with the points that he wants to make, he can also be incredibly vague at times. Like the whole business with the colors that we talked about earlier. He never says what they mean, he never says what he's trying to say with the colors, he just mentions it because it's not a point that he's trying to make, it's just something that he sees, and it's a way that he sees things, and he's not going to take the time to try to explain it to the humans that don't understand it. So death is at once blatantly unsubtle and fairly vague, which is a pretty good description of death. Death is obvious, it hits you in the face, it doesn't fool around, but at the same time we don't know a lot about it. And going back to the colors, he mentions 3 different colors in reference to the 3 times that he saw the book thief. These colors are a soupy red, a global white, and a black symbol. And as he once again tells us, just flat out tells us, these are the symbols that make up the Nazi flag. So this is another thing that we're going to see throughout the book, a lot of symbolism and a lot of metaphor, but stuff that's obviously there as symbolism and metaphor. He's telling a real person's story. He's telling the story of the book thief as he found it, as it was written down in this book that he picked up. So while that story might not contain a lot of symbolism and metaphor because it is a real life story, the spin that death puts on it will, because death sees things, again, differently than we do. And so when he sees this global white in the first scene, this black symbol in the second scene, and this soupy red in the last scene, then he is seeing these symbols of the Nazi flag, and he is going to tell us these are the symbols of the Nazi flag. And one last thing regarding the narrator, and something that will become more obvious the deeper we get into the book, he does not tell things in a linear fashion because death believes that all things are inevitable, and so he's not going to waste time creating suspense, trying to set up a plot twist or anything like that. He is just going to flat out tell us, this is the end, if it is necessary for him to tell us the end. And that's basically what he gives us here. He gives us the beginning of the story, he gives us the end of the story, and he gives us some point in the middle that we're not sure of yet. So we know that the story begins with a death, and we know that it's the book thief's brother, and we know that it ends in death, and we know that there is some death in the middle. We know that the book thief experiences death 3 times. We don't know who a lot of these people are other than the first one. We don't know if the second person has any connection to the book thief. We don't know if the last death has any connection with the book thief. We don't know. We just know that somebody died and the book thief was there. So we know that this story is going to end in death. This isn't a secret. It's never a secret, and it becomes more and more obvious who it is that's going to be dying as we read the book, but death doesn't care. Death does not care about spoilers. Death does not care about giving things away. He believes all things are inevitable, and he's just going to come right out and say it. In fact, he says it right at the beginning of the novel, you are going to die. This isn't a big secret. We all know it, and he knows it, and he's not going to fool around with trying to set up a plot twist. So basically, the narrator is breaking a lot of storytelling conventions. He's not being subtle with his points. He is being incredibly vague at times, and he is giving things away at the end. And normally this would be something that would probably bother me, but in this case it works because the narrator is death. He doesn't care. Death don't care. Death don't give a shit. Because it is death telling the story, because it is the personification of death telling this story, death permeates the very words of this story, especially in the prologue, and he will continue to as we continue throughout the story. And based on the other Markus Zusak book that I've read, which is I Am the Messenger, and which is also on the ultimate recommendation list, this seems to be Markus Zusak's basic philosophy of storytelling. Yes, storytelling is going to contain symbolism and metaphor, and it's not always going to mesh necessarily with reality, with the conventions of reality, but that's okay, because we're telling a story. We're telling a story to make a point, and we should make that point. He does kind of the same thing in I Am the Messenger, but for a completely different reason that we'll get to when we start looking at I Am the Messenger. And I find it to be actually a pretty refreshing approach to storytelling, and I like that Markus Zusak does this and does it well. So that about wraps up my portion of the discussion of the prologue of the Book Thief. If you have anything to add, please don't hesitate to leave a comment or a video response. And for sometime next week, we will be looking at part 1 and possibly parts 1 and 2, depending on how much I decide to read this week. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you continue to join me as we continue to read The Book Thief, and until next time, happy reading.